Hey guys, tonight we begin with dirt. Not the sanitized potting soil you buy in plastic bags at the hardware store, not the decorative mulch spread around suburban flower beds, but the dark, volcanic, root-threaded earth of the Guatemalan highlands, the kind of soil that remembers. We begin with the kind of agriculture that most of us have never seen, the kind that doesn't optimize or disrupt or scale, the kind that measures success not in quarterly yields, but in centuries of continuity. We begin with corn, which sounds like a humble place to start until you realize that for the Maya, corn was not a crop. It was a covenant. It was flesh and spirit and time made edible. It was the beginning and the end of everything that mattered. Before we go any further, if you're new here, consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from tonight, whether you're in a city apartment with traffic humming outside your window, or a countryside bedroom where the only sounds are crickets and wind, or somewhere in between, caught in the spaces where modern life and older rhythms still occasionally meet. I'd love to know where these words are reaching. And if this video helps you drift off, if you find yourself sinking into sleep somewhere between the planting and the harvest, a light goes a long way in helping others find these slow stories too. Now, settle in. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Maybe crack a window, turn on a fan, get that white noise humming in the background. Pull the blankets up. Let your shoulders drop. This is going to be a long, gentle journey through time and soil, through smoke and starlight, through one of the most sophisticated agricultural systems humans have ever devised. The Mayan milpa. A cornfield, yes, but also so much more than that word suggests. Here is the argument I want to make tonight, and I want you to hold it loosely as we wind through the centuries together, letting it settle into your thoughts like seeds settling into freshly turned earth. The Mayan cornfield was never just agriculture. It was a philosophy made in soil, a philosophy about patience, reciprocity, and who gets to decide what progress really means. We live in an age that worships speed, that measures success in quarterly reports and disruption cycles, that treats the earth as a resource to be extracted rather than a relationship to be maintained. We live surrounded by technologies that promise to save us time, and yet we feel more rushed than ever, more disconnected from the rhythms that once structured human life. The milpa offers a different way of thinking. Not better, necessarily. I am not here to preach or to idealize. Not a utopia or a solution to our contemporary anxieties, but different, genuinely, profoundly different. And in that difference, there might be something worth dreaming about as you drift towards sleep. There might be something worth carrying with you into the quiet hours of the night. The Maya did not stumble upon agriculture. They negotiated it, slowly, carefully, over thousands of years of observation and experiment and failure and refinement. Across a landscape that stretches from the limestone flats of the Yucatan Peninsula to the volcanic highlands of Guatemala and down through the river valleys of Honduras and Belize, the Maya developed a relationship with their environment that was part science, part spirituality, and part stubborn persistence in the face of conditions that would have defeated less patient peoples. They inherited not just land, but a way of seeing land as something alive, something with preferences and moods and memory, something that could give generously or withhold entirely, depending on how it was treated and how it was asked. This was a civilization that built pyramids reaching toward the heavens, developed one of the world's earliest and most sophisticated writing systems, calculated astronomical cycles with stunning precision that still impresses modern scientists, and maintained trade networks that spanned hundreds of miles through jungle and mountain terrain. They tracked the movements of Venus with enough accuracy to predict its appearances centuries in advance. They created a mathematical system that included the concept of zero long before European mathematicians arrived at the same insight. They were not primitive. They were not simple. They were not the mysterious civilization that popular culture sometimes portrays, vanishing inexplicably into the jungle mists. They were intelligent, adaptive, creative people who built a civilization that lasted longer than Rome and left descendants who continue to practice their traditions today. And their agriculture reflected that complexity in ways that European observers would spend centuries failing to understand. The Maya looked at the dense tropical forest around them, the forest that would have seemed impenetrable and hostile to many outsiders, and saw not an obstacle to be cleared and conquered, but a partner to be consulted and accommodated. They developed agricultural techniques that worked with the forest's rhythms rather than against them, that built fertility rather than depleting it, that fed millions of people across centuries without the soil exhaustion that plagued so many other intensive farming systems around the world. Where other civilizations eventually wore out their land and had to move on or collapse, the Maya found ways to cultivate the same landscapes for millennia. The impulse to reshape landscapes runs deep in human history, of course. Every civilization does it in its own way. The Mesopotamians irrigated their deserts and built the first cities in the fertile crescent between rivers. The Egyptians followed the Nile's annual floods and constructed monuments that still stand after 5,000 years. The Chinese terraced their hillsides and developed rice paddies that transformed mountain slopes into productive farmland. The Romans built aqueducts and roads that reorganized entire continents around their imperial vision. What made the Maya different was not that they transformed their environment, of course they did, as all human societies must, but how they understood that transformation. For them, agriculture was not conquest, it was not domination, it was not the imposition of human will on passive nature. It was conversation, it was relationship. The forest had something to say, and the wise farmer listened before he lit the first fire. This is the inheritance that every Maya farmer carried into the fields, a tradition stretching back at least 4,000 years, possibly longer, a set of techniques refined over more generations than any single person could count, and a spiritual framework that positioned the farmer not as master of the land, but as its temporary steward. The milpa system that emerged from this tradition was the physical expression of these values, a way of growing food that embedded ecological wisdom into every row, every seed, every fallow season. It was agriculture as philosophy, and the philosophy above all else was patience. The patience to wait for the right moment, the patience to let the forest rest, the patience to plant seeds whose full harvest might not be reaped for years or even generations. In a world that increasingly demands immediate results, the milpa stands as a quiet monument to a different way of measuring time. The jungle's terms. To understand what the milpa achieved, you first have to understand what it was working against. The tropical lowlands of Mesoamerica are beautiful, yes, staggeringly, almost impossibly beautiful, but beautiful in the way that difficult things can be beautiful, the way that challenges can be beautiful when you come to understand their depths. Dense forest canopy blocks most sunlight from reaching the ground, creating a dim green twilight beneath the trees where only shade-adapted plants can thrive. Humidity wraps around you like a wet blanket, thick and inescapable, making every movement an effort and every breath feel heavy. The air itself seems to have weight in these forests, pressing down on you, saturating your clothes with sweat within minutes of any exertion. The soil, and here is the cruel irony that defeated so many would-be tropical farmers throughout history, the soil in most tropical forests is surprisingly thin and poor. Look at those towering trees, those explosions of green growth climbing toward any gap in the canopy, those vines and ferns and orchids festooning every surface, and you would naturally assume you were looking at the most fertile land on Earth. All that biomass, all that exuberant life, must be growing from incredibly rich soil, but the assumption is wrong. The nutrients in a tropical forest are locked up in the living biomass itself, not stored in the earth below. The vegetation is not a product of the soil, it is a substitute for it. Everything that dies is immediately recycled by decomposers, pulled back into the living system before it can accumulate in the ground. Cut down the trees, burn away the vegetation, and you have exposed soil that will exhaust itself within a few planting seasons if you try to farm it the way you would farm temperate land. The first year might produce a decent harvest as the ash releases its stored nutrients. The second year will be worse. By the third or fourth year you will be farming dust, watching your crops struggle and fail in ground that has nothing left to give. This is the trap that defeated countless attempts at tropical agriculture, from colonial plantations to modern development schemes. The forest looks rich, but its richness is in its structure, not its soil. The Yucatan Peninsula presents its own particular challenges beyond the general difficulties of tropical agriculture. The bedrock is limestone, porous and riddled with sinkholes and underground rivers that create a landscape unlike anywhere else on Earth. There are no surface streams across much of the peninsula, no rivers winding through the forest, no lakes fed by mountain runoff. Water vanishes into the rock almost as soon as it falls, filtering down through the porous stone and reappearing in cenotes, those famous natural wells that punctuate the landscape, vertical shafts dropping down to underground pools that were sacred to the Maya and remain hauntingly beautiful today. The soil that does exist is often shallow, sometimes just inches deep, a thin layer of red earth spread over stone. When the rains come, and they come intensely during the wet season, violent downpours that can drop inches of water in an hour, the water runs off quickly, carrying topsoil with it if the ground is not protected by vegetation. When the dry season arrives, that same thin soil bakes and cracks under the relentless sun. Further south, in the Guatemalan highlands and the Petén Basin, the challenges shift but do not disappear. Volcanic soils are richer, fed by the mineral-laden ash of eruptions past and present, but the terrain is steeper, the slopes more treacherous. Erosion is a constant threat on hillsides where heavy rains can wash away a season's worth of accumulated topsoil in a single storm. The forest is denser here, the rainfall heavier, the competition from wild plants more aggressive. Every cleared field is a field the jungle is trying to reclaim. Leave it untended for a single season and you will return to find saplings already reaching toward the light, vines snaking across the ground, the forest asserting its ancient claim to land that humans only borrow. This was the landscape the Maya inherited. Not a garden waiting to be planted, not an Eden requiring only a gentle hand to yield its fruits, but a complex, demanding, occasionally hostile environment that required careful understanding and constant attention. The milpa system was their answer to these constraints, not a brute force assault on the forest, not an attempt to conquer and permanently transform the land, but a sophisticated negotiation with it. They learned to read the soil, to recognize which patches of forest would yield productive fields and which would not repay the effort of clearing. They learned to identify the trees that indicated good drainage, the plants that suggested adequate depth of earth, the subtle signs that distinguished promising land from land that would disappoint. They learned to time their clearing and burning to maximize nutrient release while minimizing erosion. Too early, and the vegetation would not be dry enough to burn cleanly. Too late, and the rains would begin before the crops could establish themselves. They learned to let the forest return when the soil was tired, trusting that rest would restore what cultivation had taken, trusting that patience would be rewarded with renewed fertility. The jungle set the terms of the negotiation. The Maya, over centuries of trial and error, of careful observation and accumulated wisdom, figured out how to meet them. The milpa dream. The word milpa comes from the Nahuatl language, the tongue of the Aztecs. Not the Maya, but the concept it describes runs deep through Mesoamerican agricultural tradition, shared across cultures and centuries. A milpa is not simply a cornfield. It is not merely a plot of ground where crops are grown. It is a system, a philosophy, a way of understanding the relationship between humans and earth, and something close to a sacred space where the boundaries between the practical and the spiritual dissolve entirely. At its most basic, a milpa is a cleared plot of forest where corn is planted alongside beans and squash, the famous three sisters of indigenous American agriculture. But this description, while technically accurate, misses almost everything important about what a milpa actually is and what it means to those who cultivate it. A milpa is a polyculture, a word that sounds technical but describes something almost intuitive. It means multiple crops growing together in the same space, each one contributing something the others need, creating a system greater than the sum of its parts. The corn grows tall, reaching for the sun with single-minded determination, its stalks rising higher and higher as the season progresses. The beans climb the cornstalks, using them as living trellises, wrapping their tendrils around the vertical supports that the corn provides. The squash spreads along the ground, its broad leaves shading the soil and suppressing weeds, creating a living carpet that protects the earth from sun and rain alike. Below the surface, invisible but essential, the beans are doing something even more important than climbing. Through a partnership with bacteria called rhizobia that live in nodules on their roots, they are pulling nitrogen from the air and fixing it in the soil, naturally fertilizing the earth for their neighbors. This is biological alchemy, a biochemical magic trick that turns atmospheric gas into plant food without any human intervention. The corn is hungry for nitrogen, all grasses are, and takes it from the soil voraciously. Planted alone, corn would exhaust the earth within a few seasons. But planted with beans, the corn's appetite is matched by the beans' generosity. What the corn takes, the beans replace. It is a closed loop, a system that feeds itself, elegant and self-sustaining. This is not primitive agriculture. This is not the fumbling attempts of people who didn't know any better. This is sophisticated, self-reinforcing systems design of a kind that modern permaculturists and agroecologists are only now beginning to fully appreciate. The Maya developed this system without soil chemistry labs, without controlled experiments, without any of the scientific apparatus we consider essential to understanding how plants grow. They developed it through generations of patient observation, through trial and error conducted across centuries, through the accumulated wisdom of countless farmers who noticed what worked and what didn't and passed that knowledge to their children. But a milpa is more than a clever arrangement of crops, more than an elegant technical solution to the problem of feeding people in difficult conditions. It is also a temporal concept, a piece of land that cycles through use and rest, cultivation and fallow, like breathing in and breathing out. A Maya farmer might clear and plant a plot for 2 or 3 years, harvesting corn and beans and squash until the soil begins to show signs of exhaustion. Then he would let it return to forest for a decade or more, moving on to work other plots in rotation while the abandoned field regenerated its fertility. The milpa is not a place, not a fixed location on a map. It is a relationship that moves across the landscape, always allowing the forest time to heal what the planting has asked of it. And a milpa is a spiritual space, charged with meaning that transcends the purely practical. The clearing of the forest, the burning of the brush, the planting of the seeds, the tending of the growing crops, the harvest that rewards the season's labour, each stage was accompanied by prayers and offerings, by rituals that acknowledged the corn as a gift rather than a possession, the harvest as a blessing rather than an entitlement. To plant a milpa was to participate in a sacred cycle, to take your place in a chain of cultivation that stretched back to the first farmers and forward to generations yet unborn. The corn fed the people, but first the people had to feed the gods, had to acknowledge their dependence and express their gratitude. It was a reciprocal arrangement, and the Maya took both sides of it seriously. This was the milpa dream, an agriculture that sustained the body, structured the community, and connected the farmer to something larger than any single harvest, larger than any single lifetime. It was never just about calories, never just about filling stomachs, though it did those things effectively for thousands of years. It was about belonging. It was about meaning. It was about finding your place in a web of relationships that included the earth below and the sky above, the ancestors who came before and the descendants who would follow, the corn that became flesh and the flesh that would return to earth to nourish future corn. The milpa was a worldview made visible, a philosophy you could walk through, a theology you could taste, the forest garden gambit. Here is where we need to address a misconception that has dogged the milpa for centuries, a misunderstanding that reveals more about the observers than about the system they were observing. The technique used to clear land for planting is often called slash and burn agriculture, a term that sounds destructive, wasteful, maybe even reckless. The phrase conjures images of careless destruction, of forests sacrificed to short-term hunger, of land laid waste by people who didn't know any better. European colonizers looked at Maya farmers cutting down trees and setting fires and saw primitive people destroying the forest out of ignorance. Modern environmentalists sometimes make the same mistake, assuming that any agriculture involving fire must be unsustainable, must be part of the problem rather than part of the solution. The reality is considerably more nuanced, considerably more intelligent than either of these dismissive views suggests. What the Maya practiced is better described as slash and mulch, or rotational forest gardening, or swidden agriculture with extended fallow periods. Yes, they cut down trees. Yes, they burned the debris. But they did so within a carefully managed system that allowed the forest to regenerate between planting cycles, that treated the forest not as an enemy to be permanently defeated, but as a partner in a long-term arrangement. A family might work 3 or 4 small plots in rotation, each one no more than a hectare or 2, while the rest of their land remained forested and resting. Over time, the entire landscape was used, but at any given moment, most of it was recovering, regrowing, rebuilding the fertility that cultivation had drawn down. This is not the same thing as deforestation. It is more like pruning a strategic removal that stimulates regrowth rather than preventing it. A gardener who prunes a fruit tree is not destroying the tree. She is managing it, shaping its growth, encouraging it to produce more abundantly. The Maya approach to the forest was similar in spirit if vastly larger in scale. They removed vegetation temporarily, extracted what they needed, and then allowed the forest to reclaim what had been taken. The system worked because it respected limits, because it gave back time for what it took in crops. The burning itself was not random destruction, not the careless torching of everything in sight. Fire released nutrients locked in the woody vegetation, turning carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus into ash that enriched the soil. A controlled burn at the end of the dry season could deposit a layer of mineral-rich ash across the cleared field, fertilizing the ground for the crops to come. Burning also killed weed seeds and pest larvae, giving the cultivated plants a cleaner start, reducing the competition they would face as they established themselves. And the timing of the burn, typically just before the rainy season began, ensured that the newly exposed soil would be quickly covered by growing crops rather than washing away in the first storms. Maya farmers were not setting fires because they lacked better options, because they didn't know about plows or irrigation or any of the techniques that European agriculture considered more advanced. They were setting fires because fire, carefully controlled and thoughtfully timed, was a tool, an effective, appropriate tool for the conditions they faced. In a landscape without draft animals, without metal tools, without the infrastructure that European agriculture took for granted, fire did work that would otherwise have required enormous amounts of human labour. It cleared vegetation, released nutrients, and prepared the soil in a single dramatic event that condensed what might otherwise have taken weeks of back-breaking effort. The fallow period was equally crucial to the system's success, perhaps even more important than the clearing and burning that got all the attention. When a plot was abandoned after a few years of cultivation, the forest did not simply reclaim it, the forest was invited back, understood as a partner in restoring what cultivation had spent. The secondary growth that sprang up on fallowed land was not wasted space. It was future farmland regenerating its fertility, storing up nutrients for harvests yet to come. Trees fixed nitrogen through their own root associations. Leaf litter accumulated and decomposed, rebuilding topsoil inch by inch. Root systems spread through the ground, preventing erosion, opening channels for water infiltration. The forest was doing the work of healing, and the Maya had learned to give it the time it needed. This was the forest garden gambit, an agriculture that used the forest's own regenerative powers as an essential part of the farming system that made an ally of what could have been an adversary. It required patience, years of waiting while the land recovered, years of trusting that the forest would return what was taken, but patience, as we have seen, was something the Maya were willing to invest. They understood that you cannot take from the land indefinitely without giving something back, that the relationship between farmer and forest had to be reciprocal if it was to last, and they were playing a long game, measured not in seasons but in generations. The corn god's architect. Now we must talk about maize itself, about the plant at the centre of the milpa, because to understand this agricultural system you must understand what corn meant to the people who planted it. And I do not mean nutritionally, though that was important. Corn provided the caloric foundation for Maya civilization, the energy that built pyramids and sustained armies and kept ordinary families alive through good years and bad. I mean spiritually, mythologically, in the deep structures of Maya thought where agriculture and theology were so intertwined that no one would have thought to separate them. Corn was not merely a crop to be grown and consumed. Corn was a god to be honoured and served, and humans, according to Maya belief, were made from corn's very flesh. The Popol Vuh is the sacred text of the Quiché Maya of highland Guatemala, a creation narrative that survived the Spanish conquest through a combination of luck, determination, and what can only be called devotion. It was transcribed in the Latin alphabet in the 16th century by Maya scribes, who had learned European writing from Spanish missionaries, an irony worth noting, that the colonizers' tools were used to preserve the colonized people's sacred stories. In the Popol Vuh, the gods make several attempts to create humans, each attempt a failure that teaches something about what humans need to be. They try mud first, but mud cannot hold its shape, cannot speak or worship, dissolves back into formlessness at the first rain. They try wood next, carving figures from trees, but the wooden people lack souls and purpose, wandering the earth without meaning, eventually destroyed in a great flood. Finally, the gods find maize specifically, yellow and white corn, the varieties that would become the staples of Mesoamerican diet, and from this they fashion the first true humans. Ground corn becomes the flesh of the first people, shaped by divine hands into beings capable of thought and gratitude and worship. We are corn walking around. We are the crop that became conscious. We are, in the Maya understanding, maize that learned to pray. This is not a metaphor the Maya took lightly, or forgot as soon as they left the temple and entered the fields. If humans are made of corn, then growing corn is not merely farming, not merely the practical business of producing food. It is participating in the fundamental creative act of the universe. Every kernel planted is an echo of that first divine creation. Every harvest gathered is a renewal of the covenant between gods and humans. The corn plant becomes a kind of relative, a being whose life cycle mirrors and enables human life. When you plant corn, you are continuing creation. When you harvest corn, you are receiving your own substance returned to you. When you eat corn, you are literally reconstituting yourself from the same material you were made of, closing a circle that connects the divine, the agricultural, and the personal in a single act of nourishment. The circularity is dizzying and beautiful, and it shaped everything about how the Maya approached their fields. The maize god appears throughout Maya art on temple walls, in painted ceramics, in stone carvings that have survived 1,000 years of tropical weather and human neglect. He is depicted as a handsome young man, often shown emerging from the earth or dancing with a kind of elegant grace, his body lithe and perfect. His hair sometimes sprouts corn silk, those fine threads that emerge from the developing ear. His headdress incorporates corn leaves, folded and arranged into elaborate shapes. His body is rendered with the litheness of a corn plant swaying in the wind, flexible and alive. He dies and is reborn with the seasons, disappearing into the underworld after harvest, descending into the darkness where seeds go and returning with the new planting, rising again as the green shoots break through the soil. The agricultural calendar was, in this sense, a religious calendar, marking not just the practical rhythms of farming, but the cosmic cycles of divine death and resurrection. Maya farmers did not work the fields merely because they had to, merely because hunger demanded it. They worked the fields because it was a form of worship, because the labour itself was prayer made physical. Every seed dropped into the earth was an offering, every weed pulled was an act of devotion, every harvest gathered was a gift received, requiring gratitude and ritual acknowledgement. The labour was hard. We should not romanticize this, should not pretend that sacred meaning made the physical effort any less exhausting, but it was meaningful labour. Labour that connected the sweating farmer bending over his rows to the deepest truths his culture had articulated about the nature of reality, the origin of humanity, the relationship between the mortal and the divine. That is a powerful thing to carry into a cornfield at dawn. That is a powerful thing to hold in your mind as the sun beats down and your back aches and the work seems endless. The Maya farmer was never just a farmer. He was a priest of the corn, a participant in cosmic cycles, a link in a chain of cultivation and worship stretching back to the first planting and forward to the end of time. Mini documentary, The Corn God's Journey. Let us pause here and go deeper into this mythology, because it is strange and beautiful and unlike anything in the European traditions that most of us inherited, and because it reveals something essential about how the Maya understood their relationship with the plants they cultivated. In the Popol Vuh, The hero twins Hunahpu and Expalanque descend into Xibalba, the underworld realm of death and darkness, to avenge their father, who was himself a form of the maize god. The story is complex, layered, full of transformations and tricks and moments of terror and beauty intertwined. Their father, Hunahpu, had been lured into the underworld by the Lords of Death, who challenged him to a ball game, the sacred sport that held deep religious significance throughout Mesoamerica. He lost, and his defeat was also his death. The Lords of Xibalba killed him and buried his body, but his head was placed in a calabash tree as a trophy, a warning to others who might dare to challenge the Lords of Death. And here the story takes a turn that defies easy interpretation, moving into territory that is both mythological and botanical, both supernatural and strangely practical. A maiden named Exquick approached the forbidden tree, curious about the skull that hung among the gourds. The head of Hunahpu spoke to her, and when she reached out her hand it spat into her palm, and from this strange conception she became pregnant with the hero twins. The Lords of Death ordered her killed when they discovered her condition, but she escaped to the surface world and gave birth to Hunahpu and Expalanque, who would grow up to become great hunters, tricksters, and eventually the avengers of their father. The twins underwent trials in the underworld that read like fever dreams, like the kind of stories that emerge from the boundary between waking and sleep. They were tested in the House of Darkness, where they had to survive a night without light. They were tested in the House of Cold, where freezing winds threatened to kill them. They were tested in the House of Jaguars, surrounded by hungry cats, and the House of Bats, where razor-winged creatures sliced through the darkness. They played the sacred ball game against the Lords of Xibalba, competing for stakes no less than life and death itself. Eventually, they allowed themselves to be killed, sacrificed, ground up like corn on a grinding stone, their bones scattered in a river, and from this death they were reborn. First as fish swimming in the water where their remains had been thrown, then as wandering performers who dazzled audiences with magic and illusion, and finally as themselves again, revealed in their true power to defeat the Lords of Death once and for all. And in their triumph they resurrected their father, the maize god, bringing him back to life so he could rise again to the surface of the earth, emerging from the underworld as corn emerges from the soil each planting season. This is the myth behind every milpa. When the corn seed is buried in the soil, it is dying. It descends into darkness, into the underworld realm where seeds go, where the mysterious transformation from dormant kernel to living plant takes place. But from that death the plant will emerge, growing toward the light, breaking through the surface as the maize god broke free from Xibalba, producing new seeds that will continue the cycle. The agricultural act recapitulates the cosmic drama. Every planting is a reenactment of the hero twins' journey. Every harvest is a resurrection. The farmer participates in myth each time he drops a seed into the waiting earth. Think about what this means for the farmer, walking into the fields at dawn, his planting bag heavy with seed corn, his digging stick worn smooth by generations of use. He is not just feeding his family, though he is doing that too. He is participating in the most sacred story his culture knows. He is reenacting creation. The sweat on his brow, the dirt under his fingernails, the backache from bending over rows of young plants, all of it is holy work. The milpa is a temple whose walls are made of cornstalks, whose altar is the earth itself, whose sacrament is the daily labour of cultivation. Maya civilization produced astronomers who could predict eclipses with stunning accuracy, architects who built pyramids aligned to solstices and equinoxes, scribes who developed one of the world's great writing systems, mathematicians who understood 0 centuries before Europeans. But perhaps their deepest intellectual achievement was this: they created an agriculture that fed the body, organised society, and made spiritual meaning out of the most basic human activity, growing food. They took something that could have been mere drudgery, mere survival, and transformed it into worship. They found the sacred in the soil. That is not primitive, that is profound. And now, let us return to the slower rhythm of our main narrative. Feel yourself settling back into the hammock of history, letting the tension in your shoulders ease, letting your breath come slower and deeper. The corn god is alive again, rising from the underworld. The seeds are in the soil, waiting for rain. The growing season is about to begin, as it has begun countless times before, as it will begin again long after we are gone. The Three Sisters. The milpa is sometimes called the Three Sisters system, a term that appears across many indigenous American cultures from the Maya lands in the south to the Haudenosaunee territories in the north. And the metaphor is apt. Corn, beans and squash are planted together not because Maya farmers lacked the land to grow them separately, not because they were forced into proximity by scarcity, but because growing them together produces results that none could achieve alone. These three plants are partners in a relationship that goes deeper than mere proximity. They need each other, they support each other, and the Maya recognized this interdependence as both practical wisdom and spiritual truth, a biological lesson in the value of cooperation. Corn is the eldest sister, if we are extending the metaphor into personality. She grows tall and fast, reaching toward the sun with single-minded determination, her stalk lengthening day by day until it towers above the other plants in the field. Her leaves are long and blade-like, angled to catch maximum sunlight, rustling with every breeze. Her stalks are strong enough to support climbing plants, but hollow enough that she needs external help to access certain nutrients. She is hungry for nitrogen, that essential element that drives green growth, and she takes it from the soil voraciously, pulling it up through her roots and incorporating it into her expanding tissues. Planted alone, corn would exhaust the earth within a few seasons, would take and take until there was nothing left to take. But corn is not planted alone in the milpa. Beans are the middle sister, the clever one who solves problems that the others cannot solve for themselves. Beans are legumes, and legumes have a trick that seems almost magical, a biological capability that sets them apart from most other plants. Through a symbiotic relationship with bacteria called rhizobia that live in nodules on their roots, they can pull nitrogen directly from the air and fix it in the soil. This is biological alchemy, a chemical transformation that turns atmospheric gas, the same nitrogen that makes up most of the air you're breathing right now, into plant food. The process is called nitrogen fixation, and it is one of the most important biochemical processes on Earth, the foundation of soil fertility in natural ecosystems. The beans climb the cornstalks, using them as living trellises, wrapping their tendrils around the vertical supports that the corn provides. In exchange for this structural support, they share their nitrogen wealth with the corn, feeding the soil that the corn is depleting, replacing what their sister takes. It is a closed loop, a cycle of giving and receiving that can continue indefinitely because what goes out comes back in. The relationship is not one-sided, not parasitic. Both plants benefit. Both plants need the other. Together they create a sustainable system that neither could maintain alone. Squash is the youngest sister, the one who takes care of the ground while the others reach for the sky. Squash plants spread outward rather than upward, sending their vines crawling across the soil surface, their broad leaves creating a living mulch that shades the earth beneath them. This shade suppresses weeds, reducing the labor needed to keep the milpa clear. Seeds of wild plants that land on the soil cannot germinate without sunlight, or if they do germinate, they cannot compete with the squash's aggressive ground coverage. The squash leaves also help retain moisture, keeping the earth cool and damp even during dry spells, reducing water loss through evaporation. Some squash varieties have prickly leaves and stems covered in tiny spines that discourage pests from wandering through the rows. Raccoons and other animals that might otherwise raid the milpa, feasting on young corn and bean plants, are deterred by the uncomfortable passage through the squash patch. The squash asks for nothing but space and returns protection for the entire system, a guardian spreading across the ground while her sisters reach toward the sky. Together, these three plants create a system that is more productive, more resilient, and more sustainable than any of them would be in monoculture. Modern agricultural science has confirmed what Maya farmers knew through generations of observation. Polycultures like the milpa produce higher total yields per hectare than single crops, require fewer external inputs like fertilizers and pesticides, and maintain soil health over longer periods. The Maya did not have soil chemistry labs, or randomized controlled trials, or peer-reviewed journals. They had patience and attention and the accumulated wisdom of ancestors who had noticed what worked. That was enough. There is something in this arrangement that feels like a moral lesson, though I promised not to preach, and I will try to keep that promise. The three sisters only thrived together. Alone, each would struggle. Corn would starve the soil, beans would sprawl on the ground, their pods rotting in the damp. Squash would compete with weeds and lose, overwhelmed by faster-growing competitors. But together, they become something greater than the sum of their parts, a system where weakness becomes strength, where individual limitation is overcome by collective capability. The milpa teaches interdependence. Whether we take that lesson to heart, whether we apply it to our own lives and societies, is up to us. The corn and beans and squash have been demonstrating the principle for 4,000 years. They continue to demonstrate it today in every milpa still cultivated. The lesson is there for anyone willing to look. The forest must rest. We live in an age that fears idleness, that views rest as waste and productivity as the highest virtue. Our economic systems are built on the assumption of perpetual growth, of more and more output extracted from the same resources year after year. Land that is not producing something measurable, a harvest, a yield, a quarterly return, feels like waste, like failure, like money left on the table. The Maya saw things differently. For them, rest was not the absence of productivity. Rest was a form of work. The forest resting was the forest rebuilding itself, storing up energy and nutrients for the next cycle of cultivation. Fallow was not neglect. Fallow was faith. A typical milpa rotation might look something like this. A farmer clears a plot of secondary forest, cutting down trees and brush that have grown up over the past decade or more of rest. He lets the cut vegetation dry under the tropical sun, waits for the right moment, then burns it, releasing the stored nutrients into a layer of ash that will fertilize the soil. He plants corn and beans and squash for 2 or 3 years, harvesting what the land offers, watching for signs of declining fertility, smaller ears of corn, less vigorous growth, increasing pressure from weeds. When those signs appear, when the soil has given what it can, he abandons the plot and moves on to clear another section of the forest. The abandoned plot is not abandoned in any final sense. It is not given up, written off, forgotten. It is simply resting. Over the next 8 to 15 years, the exact duration varied by region and soil type, and the particular demands of the landscape, the forest would reclaim it. First weeds and grasses, quick colonizers that can establish themselves in bare soil, then shrubs, woody plants that shade out the grasses and begin to rebuild the structure of the forest, then small trees reaching upward, starting to close the canopy. Then, eventually, the tall canopy species that characterize mature forest, the giants that tower overhead and create the dim green twilight of the tropics. By the time the farmer returned to that original plot, it would have regenerated its fertility, would have rebuilt its soil, would be ready to be cleared and planted again. The cycle continues. This system required a lot of land. A single family might need access to 10 or 15 times as much forest as they were actively cultivating at any moment, all the rest of it in various stages of fallow, resting and recovering for future use. From a European perspective, conditioned by centuries of intensive agriculture and private property, this looked like inefficiency, like waste, like a failure to extract maximum value from available resources. Why let all that land sit idle when it could be producing? Why wait 10 years for natural regeneration when you could fertilize and plant continuously? But the Maya understood something that industrial agriculture is only now beginning to rediscover at great cost. Soil is not a machine. You cannot run it continuously without maintenance. You cannot extract indefinitely without replenishment. Rest is not waste. Rest is regeneration. Rest is the investment that makes future harvests possible. The choice is not between producing and not producing. The choice is between producing now at the cost of producing later, or accepting lower immediate yields in exchange for sustainability across generations. The fallow system also distributed environmental risk across time and space. If a storm destroyed one plot, there were others at different stages, some newly planted, some approaching harvest, some resting. If pests infested one area, the rotation would eventually break their cycle by removing their food source for a decade. If the rains came late one year, The diversity of plots in different soil types and microclimates provided insurance against total failure. The milpa was not a single field vulnerable to a single disaster. It was a network, a constellation of clearings scattered through the forest, each one supporting the others through time. And there was something else in this practice, something harder to quantify but perhaps most important of all. The fallow period required trust. You had to believe that the forest would return, that the seeds dormant in the soil would germinate, that the animals would bring new seeds from distant areas, that fertility would regenerate through processes you could not see but had learned to rely on. You had to plant trees you would never harvest, tend land your children might farm. The milpa was an exercise in intergenerational thinking, a refusal to grab everything now at the expense of everything later. Whether that wisdom translates across cultures and centuries, whether we can learn to think in decades and generations rather than quarters and fiscal years, is a question worth sitting with as you drift towards sleep. For now, let us just note that the Maya had an answer to this question, and their answer was to let the forest rest. The planting calendar. Agriculture is always a gamble with time, a bet placed against the uncertainty of weather and season, a hope that conditions will cooperate with intentions. Plant too early and the seeds may rot in soil that is still too wet, or freeze in ground that is still too cold, or simply sit dormant, waiting for conditions that have not yet arrived. Plant too late and the growing season may not be long enough for the crop to mature, the harvest lost to the turning of the seasons. The Maya, operating in a climate defined by wet and dry seasons rather than the four-season rhythm of temperate zones, had to time their planting with particular precision. They developed sophisticated calendars to do so, calendars that combined practical observation with sacred mathematics, that wove together the movements of celestial bodies with the rhythms of rain and drought. The rainy season in most Maya lowlands runs roughly from May to October, though the exact timing varies by region and shifts somewhat from year to year. During these months, moisture comes regularly, sometimes daily, often in dramatic afternoon thunderstorms that sweep across the landscape with sudden violence and then pass, leaving the world washed and gleaming. The dry season brings little or no precipitation, sometimes for months at a time. Without irrigation, which the Maya used in some areas but not all, crops planted during the dry months would fail, would wither and die in the parched soil. The critical moment was the transition, the first rains that signaled the time to plant. Miss that window and you might lose the entire growing season. Hit it correctly and you gave your crops the maximum time to grow and mature before the next dry season began. Maya astronomers tracked the movements of stars, planets, and constellations with obsessive precision, recording their observations over centuries, building up a body of astronomical knowledge that rivals anything developed in the ancient world. The Pleiades, that tight cluster of stars visible in many parts of the world, played a particularly important role in agricultural timing. When the Pleiades disappeared below the horizon in the spring, lost in the glare of the setting sun, it signaled the approaching rainy season, the time to prepare for planting. When they reappeared in the summer, rising before dawn, the rains were fully underway and the crops were growing. Farmers watched the sky as carefully as they watched the soil, reading the heavens for signs of what the earth was about to do. The movements of Venus were also significant, tracked with an accuracy that still impresses modern astronomers. Venus goes through a complex cycle of appearances and disappearances as it orbits the Sun inside Earth's orbit, sometimes visible as the morning star before dawn, sometimes as the evening star after sunset, sometimes lost in the sun's glare entirely. The Maya tracked these phases precisely and incorporated them into their agricultural and ritual calendars, reading the planet's movements as messages about the proper timing of earthly activities. But astronomical observation was only part of the system. The Maya also used ritual calendars, complex interlocking cycles of days and months that determined auspicious and inauspicious times for every important activity, from planting and harvesting to marriage and warfare. The 260-day sacred calendar, called the Tzolkin, was not based on any astronomical observation we can identify. It was a ritual cycle, a sequence of 20-day names combined with 13 numbers to create 260 unique day signs, each with its own meaning and associations. The cycle repeated every 260 days, assigning significance to each combination, indicating which activities were favoured and which should be avoided. Certain days were favourable for planting, days when the cosmic forces aligned to support the growth of crops and the success of agricultural labour. Others were not, days when planting would be hindered by unfavourable influences, when seeds would rot or germinate poorly, when the harvest would be disappointing. A farmer who ignored the calendar risked more than a bad harvest. He risked offending the gods whose cooperation the crops required, disrupting the sacred order that the calendar helped maintain. The practical and the spiritual were not separate considerations to be weighed against each other. They were aspects of the same reality, the same system of meaning that governed all of life. There is something almost poignant in this combination of observation and faith, of empirical sky-watching and ritual adherence. The Maya watched the stars because the stars told them something true about the seasons, something reliable and predictable that could guide their practical decisions. But they also prayed and made offerings because they believed correctly, in a sense that forces beyond their control would ultimately determine whether the rains came and the crops grew. Their calendar was both scientific instrument and sacred text, a tool for reading the future that acknowledged, implicitly, how much of that future remained unknowable. They did what they could, observed what they could observe, calculated what they could calculate, and then they trusted. They made their offerings and said their prayers and waited for the rains to come or not come, knowing that some things were beyond human control, that the relationship with the earth and the sky required humility as well as knowledge, cultivation as ritual. Let us follow a Maya farmer through a single agricultural cycle, walking beside him from the first clearing to the final harvest, experiencing the rhythm of the milpa year as he experienced it. It is early spring in the Yucatan, though the Maya would not have used those words. It would have marked the season by the position of stars and the dryness of the air, rather than by calendar dates derived from distant Rome. The dry season is waning, the rains perhaps a month or two away. The forest plot he has selected for this year's milpa has been resting for 12 years, long enough that substantial trees have grown back among the brush, their canopy beginning to close overhead. The soil has had time to recover its fertility. It is time to begin clearing. But before the first machete stroke falls, before the first tree is felled or the first brush is cut, there are rituals to perform. The farmer must ask permission of the forest, of the spirits that inhabit it, of Yum Karks, the lord of the woods, whose domain he is about to enter and transform. He may bring offerings, copal incense, whose fragrant smoke carries prayers upward toward the sky, perhaps some food or drink, perhaps a few drops of his own blood, drawn from tongue or ear in the ancient way. He kneels at the edge of the plot, speaks words that his father taught him and his father's father before that, words addressed to powers he cannot see but whose presence he feels. He explains what he is about to do, asks for understanding, promises to let the forest return when the planting cycles are complete. This is not empty performance, not ritual gone through without meaning. The Maya genuinely believed that the forest was ensouled, that it could grant or withhold cooperation, that the relationship between farmer and land was mutual, requiring respect from both parties. The clearing itself is hard physical labour, among the hardest work the agricultural year requires. Trees must be cut, their trunks severed by repeated blows of the machete or axe, their fall guided to land where they will dry without crushing the vegetation still standing. Brush must be hacked down, tangled masses of vines and shrubs reduced to piles of debris. The work is slow and exhausting, conducted in the heat and humidity of the tropical dry season, sweat soaking through clothes within the first hour and continuing all day long. This work might occupy several weeks, the farmer and perhaps his sons working in the relative cool of morning, resting during the brutal midday heat when the sun beats down with physical force, returning for another few hours of labour before dusk falls and the darkness makes work impossible. The forest resists. Vines clutch at the machete, tangling the blade. Roots grip the limestone, making it difficult to remove stumps. Insects swarm around the workers, biting and stinging, drawn by the sweat and the disturbance of their habitat. Every cleared hectare represents dozens of hours of labour, hundreds of machete strokes, thousands of calories burned. There is nothing romantic about this work. It is exhausting, repetitive, physically demanding in ways that few modern people ever experience. The spiritual meaning does not eliminate the physical difficulty. The prayers do not make the trees fall easier. The farmer returns home each evening with aching muscles and blistered hands, falls into his hammock, and rises the next morning to do it again. Then comes the burning. The timing must be right, late enough in the dry season that the brush is thoroughly dried, the moisture cooked out of it by weeks of tropical sun, early enough that the rains have not yet begun. A miscalculated burn could be disastrous. If the vegetation is too wet, it will smoulder rather than blaze, leaving partially charred debris that will complicate planting and reduce the nutrient release. If the rains come before the burn, the whole process might have to wait another year, the labour of clearing wasted. The farmer watches the sky, consults his calendar, reads the signs in the wind and the clouds. When the moment is right, he sets the fire. A successful burn is dramatic, almost terrifying. Flames leap through the dried brush, spreading quickly across the cleared area, consuming everything combustible in their path. Smoke rises in thick columns visible for miles. The heat is intense, driving the farmer back from the field's edge. The crackling of the fire, the crash of burning branches, the roar of flames finding new fuel, it is a small apocalypse, contained but fierce. Done well, the burning leaves a cleared field covered in a layer of grey-white ash ready to receive seeds. Done poorly if the brush was too wet or the fire too cool, or the wind shifted at the wrong moment, the burning may be incomplete, leaving partially charred debris that will require additional labour to clear. After burning, more rituals. Thanks must be given for the successful clearing, for the fire that behaved as hoped, for the transformation of forest into field. The field must be blessed before planting can begin, prayers said over the ash-covered ground, offerings made to the gods of corn and rain and earth. When the first rains come, those fat drops spattering into the ash, mixing with it to create a muddy paste rich in nutrients, the farmer will walk the rows with a digging stick, making holes at regular intervals, dropping in seeds of corn and beans, perhaps marking some spots for squash to be planted later. Each seed placed in the earth is an act of faith, a bet on the future, a prayer made physical. The rains must continue, the corn must germinate, the beans must climb, the squash must spread. So many variables lie beyond any farmer's control. So much depends on forces he can influence but not command. The growing season brings its own work, weeding to keep the milpa clear of competitors, watching for pests that might destroy the young plants, hoping for rain but not too much, for sun but not too harsh. The Maya farmer visits his milpa daily, walking the forest paths in the early light, checking the progress of his crops, pulling the weeds that threaten to overwhelm his plants. This is not dramatic labour, not the intense exertion of clearing and burning. It is steady, patient, repetitive, the kind of work that structures days and seasons, that gives shape to time, that can be done almost automatically while the mind wanders elsewhere. And finally, the harvest. If all has gone well, if the rains came at the right times and in the right amounts, if the pests were kept at bay, if no storms flattened the corn or floods drowned the fields, the corn plants are heavy with ears, the papery husks hiding rows of yellow or white kernels. The beans have dried in their pods, rattling when shaken, ready to be threshed and stored. The squash have swelled on the ground, their hard shells protecting the sweet flesh within. The farmer gathers what the earth has given, carrying loads back to the village for storage and processing, and he gives thanks again, completing the cycle of asking and receiving that defines the milpa relationship. This is what cultivation as ritual looks like, every stage accompanied by acknowledgement, gratitude, and request. The Maya farmer was never alone in his fields, never simply a worker performing tasks. He worked in partnership with gods, with ancestors, with the living earth itself. The labour was hard, make no mistake about that. Do not let the spiritual dimension obscure the physical reality, but it was meaningful labour. Labour embedded in a web of significance that extended far beyond the individual and the immediate. That is rare in human experience. That is worth remembering as you drift towards sleep, as the rhythm of the agricultural year becomes the rhythm of your breathing, slow and steady, patient and trusting. Mini documentary. A day in the milpa. Let us stay with our farmer for a single day, following him from darkness to darkness, watching the ordinary rhythms of milpa life unfold in real time. It is midsummer in the Yucatan lowlands. The corn is waist-high and growing fast, adding inches every week, its leaves spreading to catch the abundant sunlight. The rains have been coming regularly, almost too regularly. The paths are muddy, the humidity oppressive, everything damp and fecund and alive. But the crops look healthy, the corn green and vigorous, the beans beginning to flower, the squash spreading across the ground as it should. There is weeding to do, as there always is. Our farmer has work ahead of him. He wakes before dawn. The village is dark except for the occasional glow of a cooking fire, flames flickering through the gaps in a wall or the open doorway of a neighbour's house. His wife is already up, has been up for some time, preparing tortillas for his morning meal. The sound of her hands patting the corn dough, the rhythmic slap, slap, slap of the tortilla being shaped, is one of the most familiar sounds of his life, the soundtrack of every morning he can remember. The smell of corn toasting on the clay comel, that flat griddle that sits over the fire, mixes with the wood smoke and the damp morning air. These sensations, the sounds, the smells, the dim light of early dawn will accompany his first waking moments for the rest of his life, as they accompanied his father's and will accompany his children's. He eats quickly, sitting on a low stool near the fire. A few tortillas, warm from the comal, folded around mashed black beans seasoned with a bit of chile. Perhaps a cup of atol, the corn-based drink that provides quick energy, warm and slightly sweet. The meal is simple but sustaining. The same meal his ancestors ate for generations, the same meal that will fuel him through the morning's work. Then he gathers his tools, a machete for clearing brush, its blade sharpened the night before, a digging stick for any transplanting needed, worn smooth by generations of use, a gourd of water to drink during the hot hours ahead. The walk to the milpa takes about 20 minutes, though he does not measure it in minutes. The path winds through secondary forest, past plots in various stages of fallow and cultivation. Some are just starting their regrowth, scrubby and low, tangled with vines and brush that will gradually sort themselves into taller vegetation. Others have mature trees, their canopy closing overhead, almost ready for another clearing in a few years' time. Our farmer knows every plot, knows their histories and their personalities, can tell you when each was last planted and how well it yielded, which spots are rocky and which have deep soil, where the drainage is good and where water pools after heavy rains. This is not abstract land, not property measured in hectares and assessed for tax purposes. This is his family's landscape, mapped in memory across generations, known through direct experience rather than survey and document. He arrives at the milpa as the sky begins to lighten in the east, the darkness giving way to grey and then to the soft gold of early tropical dawn. The first hour of work is the best hour, the most pleasant time to be in the fields, while the air is still cool enough to be comfortable and the mosquitoes have not yet emerged in force. He moves through the rows of corn, checking the plants, looking for signs of damage or disease, pulling weeds that have appeared since his last visit. The squash leaves are heavy with dew, droplets catching the early light. A bird he cannot see is singing somewhere in the surrounding forest, its song familiar but never quite identifiable. There is a particular quality to this early light in the tropics, soft and golden, almost liquid, the shadows long and gentle before the sun climbs, high enough to turn harsh that painters have tried to capture, and never quite succeeded in rendering. By mid-morning, the heat is building. The sun has climbed above the forest canopy, and its rays fall directly on the milpa, warming the air and the soil and the farmer's back. Our farmer has cleared a section of the milpa that was getting overgrown with weeds, the cut vegetation piled at the field's edge to dry and eventually be burned. His shirt is soaked with sweat, clinging to his back, wrung wet and then wet again with each hour of exertion. The mosquitoes have found him now, hovering around his head, landing on any exposed skin. He takes a break, sitting in the shade at the edge of the clearing, drinking from his gourd. The water is warm but welcome. Above him, a hawk circles on the thermals that are starting to build, rising columns of heated air that will grow stronger as the day goes on. The midday hours are for rest. Only a fool works through the hottest part of the tropical day, when the sun is directly overhead and its heat is brutal, punishing, dangerous. Our farmer returns to the village, walking the familiar path in reverse, arriving home drenched in sweat. He eats another meal, more tortillas, perhaps some meat if the family is fortunate enough to have it, chiles and tomatoes from the garden by the house. His wife serves him, as she has done every day of their marriage, as her mother did for her father. The meal is quiet, conversation minimal, the heat making even talking feel like effort. After eating, he lies in his hammock through the hottest part of the day, the hammock swaying gently if there is any breeze, still and heavy if the air is calm. He does not quite sleep, the heat makes true sleep difficult, but he rests, letting his mind drift, listening to the sounds of the village around him, children playing in the shade, women talking as they work, a dog barking at something unseen, the occasional crow of a rooster who has lost track of time. The ceiling of his house is made of palm thatch, carefully woven to shed rain, and if he looks up, he can see the intricate pattern of the fronds, the way they interlock and overlap. He has looked at this ceiling thousands of times. It is as familiar as his own hands. Late afternoon brings a return to the milpa. The heat has relented slightly, the sun dropping toward the western horizon, the shadows beginning to lengthen again. There are a few more hours of usable work time before darkness falls, and our farmer makes the most of them. He finishes clearing the section he started in the morning, then walks the perimeter of the field, checking for any damage from animals or insects, looking for places where the fence of brush he built to protect the milpa might need repair. The corn is growing well, taller than it was a week ago, its leaves healthy and green. The beans are climbing as they should, their tendrils wrapping around the corn stalks. The squash vines are spreading across the ground, covering more territory each day. He allows himself a moment of satisfaction, standing at the edge of his milpa, looking out over the rows of growing plants. This is his work, his and the gods', his and the earth's. The harvest, if it comes, will feed his family through the dry season, will provide seed for next year's planting, will be ground into masa and shaped into tortillas and eaten day after day until the next harvest comes. But satisfaction is always tempered by knowledge. So much can still go wrong between now and then. A storm could flatten the corn, pests could infest the beans, the rains could stop too early or continue too long. Farming is never certain. The milpa teaches humility along with patience. The walk home is different from the morning walk. The light is different, golden and horizontal instead of grey and rising, casting long shadows across the path. The sounds are different, the evening insects beginning their chorus, the birds calling their last songs before night. Our farmer is tired in a way that is familiar and not unpleasant, the honest fatigue of physical labour that has accomplished something visible and real. His wife has prepared the evening meal. His children have stories to tell about their day, small adventures and observations that they share as the family eats together. The evening passes in conversation and quiet, the fire burning low, the last light fading, the stars appearing one by one above the village, the same stars his ancestors watched, the same stars his descendants will watch after he is gone. And then he sleeps. His hammock creaks softly as he settles into it, the woven cotton conforming to his body, holding him suspended in the darkness. Tomorrow he will wake before dawn and do it again. And the day after that, and the day after that. This is the rhythm of the milpa. Repetitive, patient, slow. It is not dramatic. It is not heroic in any obvious way. But it sustained a civilization for thousands of years. And there is something heroic in that persistence, something worth honouring as we ourselves struggle to stay awake, struggle to keep our own eyes open in the comfortable darkness, critics and colonisers. When the Spanish arrived in Mesoamerica in the early 16th century, they brought with them more than weapons and disease. They brought a set of assumptions about what agriculture should look like, about what constituted proper farming, about the relationship between humans and land. European farming was intensive, based on ploughing, annual cropping, and the integration of livestock. Fields were permanent, defined by boundaries that remained fixed from year to year and generation to generation. Land ownership was recorded in documents, transferred through legal processes, taxed by governmental authorities. The goal was to extract maximum production from every acre, every year, indefinitely. The milpa system, viewed through this lens, looked primitive, wasteful, and lazy. Spanish colonial administrators could not understand why Maya farmers let so much land go to waste in fallow. They could not see the logic of a rotational system that used perhaps 1/10 of available land at any given time. They assumed, because their agricultural tradition assumed, because their economic system assumed that more intensive cultivation was always better, that fallowing was failure, that the forest should be permanently cleared rather than allowed to return. They looked at Maya farmers and saw people who lacked the knowledge or the ambition to farm properly. They were wrong, catastrophically wrong, but their wrongness had consequences that continue to reverberate today. The colonial period brought massive disruptions to traditional Maya agriculture. The encomienda system granted Spanish colonizers rights to indigenous labor, rights that functioned in practice like slavery even when they were theoretically something else. Maya farmers who should have been tending their own milpas were instead required to work Spanish fields, build Spanish buildings, carry Spanish goods, serve Spanish households. The time and energy that had sustained family agriculture for generations was redirected toward colonial extraction. Milpas went untended. Fallow cycles were interrupted. The careful balance of work and rest that the system required was thrown into chaos. The Congregación policy was perhaps even more damaging in the long term, though its effects were slower to manifest. Spanish administrators, for both religious and administrative convenience, forced dispersed rural populations to relocate into concentrated towns. Scattered homesteads near family milpas were abandoned. People were compelled to move into planned settlements where they could be more easily converted to Christianity, more easily taxed, more easily controlled. This policy made it easier for missionaries to count souls and administrators to collect tribute, but it severed the connection between families and the scattered forest plots they had cultivated for generations. The milpa system required access to extensive forest lands in various stages of fallow, lands that might be a half-hour's walk or more from the family home. When farmers were moved away from those lands, when they could no longer visit their plots daily, when the distance between village and field became prohibitive, the system collapsed. And there were the diseases. Smallpox arrived first, sweeping through populations that had no immunity, that had never encountered this particular pathogen, that had no traditional medicines or nursing practices adapted to its symptoms. Measles followed, and typhus and influenza, and a dozen other old-world diseases that were deadly but manageable in Europe and absolutely devastating in the Americas. Wave after wave of epidemic illness swept through Maya communities, killing perhaps 90% of the population in some areas over the first century of contact. It is hard to overstate the devastation, hard to find analogies in modern experience that capture the scale of loss. Imagine 9 of every 10 people you know dying within a few generations. Imagine your family, your neighbours, your community, your civilization reduced to a remnant. The labour force that had maintained the milpa system was decimated. The young and the old died in equal numbers. Knowledge that had been passed down through families was lost when entire lineages were wiped out. The social structures that organised communal work disintegrated. The priests who knew the rituals, the elders who knew the planting calendars, the experienced farmers who could read the soil and the sky, so many of them died that the transmission of knowledge was broken. The colonial wound was not just physical, not just demographic. It was also epistemic, a wound to knowledge, to tradition, to the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Spanish colonizers dismissed Maya agriculture as primitive and tried to replace it with European methods. Maya languages were suppressed. Children were educated in Spanish, punished for speaking their parents' tongues. Maya religious practices were forbidden. The rituals that accompanied planting and harvest were condemned as paganism, their practitioners persecuted. The integration of agriculture and spirituality that had given the milpa its meaning was attacked from both sides. The practical techniques disrupted while the spiritual framework was condemned and suppressed. And yet the milpa survived. That survival is almost miraculous given the forces arrayed against it. Through all the destruction, through all the death and displacement and cultural suppression, Maya farmers continued to plant corn and beans and squash in the old ways. They maintained the seeds, saved year after year, handed down from parent to child. They preserved the techniques, adapted perhaps but recognizable, still functional in the forests of Guatemala and the Yucatan. They continued the prayers, whispered rather than proclaimed, hidden from colonial authorities who would have forbidden them. The colonial wound was deep, but it was not fatal. The milpa endured, the longest harvest. Despite everything, the conquest, the colonization, the disease, the displacement, the forced labor, the cultural suppression, the centuries of marginalization and neglect, the milpa survived. That fact alone is worth sitting with for a moment, worth holding in your mind as you settle deeper into whatever comfort surrounds you tonight. Conquest, colonization, disease, displacement, forced labor, cultural suppression, the Maya endured. Catastrophes that would have erased many peoples from history entirely, that did erase many peoples and their agricultural traditions and their accumulated wisdom. And through it all, in highland Guatemala and lowland Belize, in Chiapas and the Yucatan, in forests and villages throughout the Maya world, farmers continued to plant corn and beans and squash in the old ways. The milpa persisted. There is something stubborn in this persistence, something that defies explanation in purely practical terms. Yes, the milpa was an effective agricultural system, proven over millennia. Yes, it produced reliable yields under difficult conditions. Yes, the techniques worked, feeding families and communities generation after generation. But the Maya preserved the milpa even when they were forbidden to, even when colonial authorities tried to impose different methods, even when it would have been easier and perhaps more immediately profitable to abandon their traditions and adopt European crops and techniques. They preserved it because it was theirs, because it connected them to ancestors, because the corn that fed their bodies was also the corn that made their bodies, according to beliefs that no colonial power could erase, because identity and sustenance were not separate things but aspects of the same reality. The longest harvest is not measured in seasons but in generations. The milpa has been feeding Maya communities for at least 4,000 years. Possibly longer, the archaeological record becomes uncertain as we push back further, but the practice is certainly ancient, certainly predating written records, certainly stretching back into the mists of early Mesoamerican settlement. 4,000 years is an almost incomprehensible span of time, roughly 160 generations, each one inheriting seeds and techniques and stories from the generation before, each one passing them forward to the generation that follows. The farmer who plants a milpa today is connected by an unbroken chain of practice to farmers who lived before the pyramids of Tikal were built, before the hieroglyphic writing system was developed, before the classic Maya civilization reached its heights and then declined and transformed into something else. This is what persistence looks like. Not monuments of stone, though the Maya built those too and some still stand. Not written records, though they created those as well, and some survive. The deepest persistence is carried in seeds passed from hand to hand, in knowledge transmitted from parent to child, in the daily practice of doing what your ancestors did, because they learnt it from their ancestors, and it works, and it is meaningful, and it is sacred. The milpa is living archaeology, not dead and buried, but alive and productive. It is tradition, not as museum piece, but as ongoing practice. It is the past continuing to feed the present, literally, every day, in every tortilla made from corn grown in the old way. And there is a lesson here, perhaps, about what endures. Empires rise and fall, the Maya themselves built several, watched them flourish and decline, survived their endings. Cities are built and abandoned. The great Maya centers of the classic period stand empty now, their pyramids rising above the forest that has reclaimed their plazas. Writing systems are developed and forgotten. Maya hieroglyphic writing was lost for centuries, only deciphered in our own time. But the need to eat continues. The relationship between humans and soil continues. The seed planted in spring and harvested in fall and planted again the following spring, that cycle continues. The milpa outlasted the classic Maya collapse, survived the Toltec invasions, persisted through the Spanish conquest, continued through Mexican independence and Guatemalan civil war and all the upheavals of modern history. It is still here. The farmers are still planting, The corn is still growing. That persistence is its own kind of monument. Abundance without empire. One of the strange features of Maya civilization, one that has puzzled scholars for generations, is that it never unified into a single empire. Unlike the Aztecs to the north, who built a centralized state that dominated much of Mesoamerica before the Spanish arrived, or the Inca to the south, who created an empire stretching thousands of miles along the Andes, the Maya remained politically fragmented. A mosaic of city-states that traded and allied and warred with each other but never consolidated under a single ruler. There was no Maya emperor, no Maya capital, no unified Maya state. Instead, there were dozens of independent kingdoms, each with its own ruling dynasty, its own patron gods, its own political ambitions. Scholars have proposed many explanations for this pattern. The difficult terrain, perhaps, made unified control impractical. The lack of draft animals, the Maya had no horses, no oxen, no wheeled vehicles made long-distance military campaigns and administrative control more difficult. The nature of Maya political competition, focused on individual rulers and their claims to divine legitimacy, may have worked against consolidation. But one factor that is rarely considered is agricultural. The milpa system may have been inherently resistant to the kind of centralization that empires require. Empires are expensive. They require large standing armies to conquer and hold territory, bureaucracies to administer far-flung provinces, infrastructure to move goods and soldiers and information across distances. They need to extract surplus from their populations, surplus food, surplus labor, surplus wealth, and channel that surplus toward the center, toward the capital, toward the ruler and his court. The agricultural systems that supported classical empires were typically intensive. Permanent fields, irrigation works, concentrated labor, maximum output per unit of land. This intensity generated the surplus that made empire possible. Mesopotamia and Egypt, Rome and China all were built on intensive agriculture that produced more than the farmers themselves consumed, surplus that could be taxed and traded and transformed into state power. The milpa does not work that way. It is productive, feeding dense populations and supporting complex societies, but it is not intensifiable in the same manner as field crop agriculture. You cannot simply clear more forest and plant more corn indefinitely. The fallow rotations place limits on how much land can be under cultivation at any time. Push too hard, shorten the fallows too much, and soil fertility declines, yields drop, the system begins to fail. You cannot concentrate agricultural labor because the system requires dispersed plots managed by individual families over extended cycles. There is no equivalent to the great estate or the plantation in milpa agriculture. You cannot extract unlimited surplus because the surplus is tied up in forest regrowth, in future fertility rather than present production. This is not a design flaw. It may actually be a feature, a characteristic that protected Maya communities from the worst excesses of centralized power. The milpa created what we might call abundance without empire, enough food to support dense populations, elaborate cities, complex societies with art and architecture and astronomy, but not the kind of extractable surplus that lets a single power dominate all others indefinitely. Maya city-states could grow wealthy and powerful, could build pyramids and wage wars and sponsor great works of art, but they could not grow infinitely. The agricultural base placed a ceiling on centralized extraction. The forest gardens imposed limits that ambition could not transcend. There is an irony here that might be worth noting, though I promised not to preach and will try to keep that promise. Modern industrial agriculture is all about removing limits, about pushing productivity ever higher through inputs of fertilizer and pesticide and machinery, through genetic modification and precision farming, and all the technologies of the Green Revolution and its successors. The result has been abundance beyond anything the Maya could have imagined, and also dependence on fossil fuels, soil degradation, water pollution, biodiversity loss, climate disruption. The promised abundance turns out to be fragile, dependent on inputs that may not always be available, generating costs that are only beginning to be counted. The milpa accepted limits. It built those limits into its structure, and within those limits, it sustained civilization for millennia. Whether we have anything to learn from that trade-off, whether the milpa offers any wisdom relevant to our own situation, is a question you can answer for yourself. I am just describing what the Maya did, how they organized their relationship with the land, what choices they made and what consequences followed. The corn is growing in the fields. The forest is resting, preparing for future harvests. The limits are there, quiet and patient, waiting to be respected or ignored. The field's rhythm. If you have ever done repetitive physical work, the kind of work that engages your body but leaves your mind free to wander, you know there is a particular quality of time that emerges from such labour. Hours pass without your noticing them pass. Thoughts drift and settle like leaves on still water. The rhythm of the task becomes hypnotic, almost meditative, the same movements repeated until they become automatic, until the body knows what to do without the mind's direction. The milpa farmer lived inside this quality of time for much of the year. There was the rhythm of clearing, the swing of the machete, the thunk of blade meeting wood, the pause to wipe sweat from the brow, the next swing. Each stroke the same, each stroke slightly different, the body finding its most efficient motion and repeating it hundreds of times per day. There was the rhythm of planting. Bend, dig with the planting stick. Drop the seeds, cover, step forward, repeat. Bend, dig, drop, cover, step. The pattern inscribed in muscle memory, performed without thought. There was the rhythm of weeding. Crouch, identify the intruder, pull it from the soil, toss aside, shift position, repeat. Hour after hour of the same motion, the same judgment, the same small action. Each task had its pace, its tempo, its pattern of exertion and rest. The body learned these rhythms and settled into them, finding the most sustainable cadence, the speed that could be maintained from dawn to midday without exhaustion. Muscle memory took over so that the hands knew what to do without conscious direction, leaving the mind free to wander wherever it would. This is not romantic. Repetitive agricultural labour is hard on the body. Backs ache from constant bending, knees stiffen from hours in the crouch. Hands callous and crack, split open, heal and split again. The Maya farmer was not practicing yoga in his cornfield, not experiencing some idealized communion with nature. He was working, and the work was physically demanding, taking a toll that accumulated over years and decades. But there is something in the regularity of such work, the predictability of it, that creates a kind of mental space that modern life rarely provides. When you know what you will be doing for the next several hours, when your body can proceed on autopilot, your mind is free to go elsewhere. It can wander across memory and imagination, can compose and solve and dream. There is no email to check, no notification to respond to, no screen demanding attention. There is only the work, the rhythm, the slow passage of time marked by the progress of rows weeded or ground cleared. What did Maya farmers think about as they worked their milpas? We cannot know for certain, cannot reconstruct the interior lives of people who left no diaries or memoirs. But we can guess that their thoughts wandered across the same terrain that occupies anyone engaged in repetitive labour. Plans for the day, worries about the family, memories of past seasons good and bad, anticipation of the meal to come. Perhaps they prayed, the rhythm of the work becoming the rhythm of the prayer. Perhaps they composed songs that have been lost to us, melodies that no one recorded. Perhaps they simply existed in a state of thoughtless presence, aware of their bodies moving through space and time, connected to the earth beneath their feet and the sun above their heads. The Industrial Revolution separated most of us from this kind of work. Machines perform the repetitive tasks now. We sit at desks, our bodies still while our minds race from screen to screen, from task to task, from notification to notification. There is much to be said for this change. Fewer broken backs, less tedious labour, greater productivity per hour worked. But something was lost as well, something hard to name but real nonetheless. The field's rhythm is gone for most of us. The hypnotic quality of physical work in time with the seasons, the sense of the body as a working instrument rather than a vehicle to be exercised after hours, the mental freedom that comes from knowing exactly what you will be doing, until the sun moves far enough across the sky. These are experiences that modern life has largely erased. The milpa farmer knew them intimately. Whether that is something to mourn or simply note, whether we should want those experiences back or be grateful to be rid of them, is perhaps not a question with a single answer. But as you lie there in the darkness, as you settle towards sleep, you might notice the quality of your own mind wandering, the way it drifts when there is no task demanding its attention, the way it finds its own rhythm in the quiet. The milpa farmer knew that quality of mind too. He spent his working life inside it, finding their place. Over time, over centuries and millennia of cultivation and consumption, corn and beans and squash became more than food. They became identity. They became culture. They became the medium through which Maya people understood themselves and their place in the world. The Maya did not eat tortillas simply because tortillas happened to be what their ancestors had eaten, because they were the convenient local option. They ate tortillas because tortillas were what Maya people ate, because the corn that became tortillas was the corn that had made their ancestors' flesh. Because to eat corn was to participate in a tradition that stretched back to the first humans and forward to the end of time. Food became culture, agriculture became ancestry. The tortilla is perhaps the most humble and most important food in Mesoamerican history. It is nothing but ground corn, mixed with water, patted flat, and cooked on a hot surface. It requires no leavening, no oven, no special equipment beyond a grinding stone and a comal. A child can learn to make passable tortillas. A lifetime of practice can make them sublime. And yet this simple food is an engineering marvel, a solution to a nutritional problem that the Maya solved thousands of years before modern chemistry explained why. The key is nixtamalization, a word that sounds technical but describes something almost alchemical. Raw corn kernels, if simply ground and eaten, are not particularly nutritious. They contain carbohydrates and some protein, but key nutrients, particularly niacin, are locked in chemical forms that human digestion cannot access. Populations that adopted corn as a staple without also adopting nixtamalization suffered from pellagra, a niacin deficiency disease that causes skin lesions, diarrhea, dementia, and death. European and American populations who ate corn imported from the Americas, but did not learn how the Maya prepared it, experienced pellagra epidemics well into the 20th century. The Maya never did, because they discovered we do not know how, through what accident or experiment or divine revelation, that soaking corn kernels in an alkaline solution of water and lime, then grinding them into dough, transformed the grain into something far more nutritious. The nixtamalization process breaks down the kernel's outer hull, softens the interior, and releases niacin in a form the body can absorb. It also makes the corn easier to grind, gives the resulting dough a distinctive flavor and aroma, and produces tortillas that are more flexible and more digestible than untreated corn would allow. The Maya figured out the chemistry thousands of years before chemistry existed as a discipline, thousands of years before anyone could explain why their method worked. The daily preparation of tortillas was women's work in most Maya communities, and it was labor-intensive in a way that is difficult for modern people to appreciate. There were no blenders, no food processors, no electric mills. Corn kernels had to be boiled with lime, left to soak overnight, then ground by hand on a stone metate, a heavy sloping slab of volcanic rock paired with a handheld grinding stone called a mano. The grinding required strength and endurance. Hours of kneeling over the metate, pressing the mano down and forward, turning dry kernels into wet dough through pure physical effort. A family might consume dozens of tortillas in a day, each one requiring its moment of attention on the comal. The rhythm of tortilla making was its own kind of meditation. The slap, slap, slap of hands shaping dough, the sizzle of the comal, the stack of finished tortillas wrapped in cloth to stay warm. Tamales were for special occasions. Corn dough wrapped around fillings of meat or beans or chiles, encased in leaves and steamed until cooked through. Black beans, the second sister, were prepared in many ways mashed into paste, cooked whole in broth, combined with corn and squash in stews and soups. The squash provided variety and nutrition, its flesh sweet and dense, its seeds rich in oils and protein. Atole in the morning thick and warm, pozole for ceremonies, kernels of corn floating in rich broth, chocolate for the elite, ground cacao mixed with water and spices, frothed until foamy, served in painted ceramic cups. The milpa's three sisters fed into a culinary tradition that was varied and sophisticated, adapted to every occasion from the simplest daily meal to the most elaborate sacred feast. Food marked time, distinguishing ordinary days from festival days, dry season from wet season, planting from harvest. Food marked status, some dishes reserved for nobles and priests, while others were the universal fare of farmers and workers. Food marked identity in ways that went far beyond nutrition, ways that connected the person eating to their family, their community, their ancestors, their gods. This is what happens when agriculture becomes culture. The crops stop being merely useful and start being meaningful. They accrue traditions, stories, proper ways of preparation and consumption that must be maintained. They become cultural furniture, the background against which life happens, as unremarkable as air and as necessary. Corn was not exotic for the Maya. Corn was ordinary, taken for granted, invisible precisely because it was everywhere and always. And that ordinariness was itself a kind of triumph, the mark of a system so successful, so deeply integrated into daily life, that it had disappeared into the fabric of normal existence. The farmer's walk. There is a particular quality to walking through a tropical forest, a sensory experience unlike any other kind of travel. The light filters through leaves, green and dappled, shifting as the wind moves the canopy. The air is cooler than open ground would be, humid but shaded, carrying the smell of decomposition and growth intermingled. Sounds are muffled and transformed, the calls of birds and insects absorbed by the vegetation, distant noises seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. Your footsteps are quiet on the soft forest floor. You become aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, your own small presence in a larger living system. For Maya farmers, this forest walk was a daily transition, a commute between village life and agricultural work that took them through a landscape alive with meaning. The path from home to milpa was not merely a practical route, but a journey between worlds, between the domestic and the sacred, between the social self and the self that worked alone with the earth. The paths that connected villages to milpas were not wilderness trails blazed through virgin forest. They were maintained routes, used for generations, their courses determined by the easiest passage through the terrain, and the locations of family fields established over decades or centuries. Routes that would have caught an unfamiliar foot had been worn smooth by thousands of passages. Branches that would have blocked the way had been cleared long ago. The paths were as familiar as hallways in a house, navigable in darkness if necessary, known in every detail. Walking them, a farmer would pass through multiple zones, each with its own character and ecology. First, the edge of the village, where gardens grew beside houses and fruit trees shaded the paths. Then the secondary growth of recently fallowed fields, scrubby and tangled, still recovering from their last cultivation. Then older fallow, where substantial trees had grown back, the canopy beginning to close. Then, if the milpa was far enough away, the mature forest, where the canopy blocked most light and the understory opened into a dim green cathedral. Each zone had its plants and animals, its particular feeling, its sounds and smells. Maya farmers knew these paths intimately, knew them the way you know the route from your bedroom to your kitchen. They knew which trees marked the boundary of family land, which stream crossing was slippery after rain, which section of trail became muddy in the wet season. They knew where the howler monkeys called in the early morning, their roars echoing through the trees. They knew where the snakes were likely to sun themselves in the afternoon, coiled on warm rocks or draped across branches. This was not abstract environmental knowledge learned from books. It was embodied, practical, necessary for daily life. The forest was not a map to be consulted. It was a lived space, known through direct experience accumulated over a lifetime. The walk to the milpa was also a transition in mindset. The village was social space, children running underfoot, neighbours calling greetings, obligations and conversations and the noise of community. The milpa was solitary space, or at most a space shared with a few family members working side by side in companionable silence. The walk between them was liminal, a passage from one mode of being to another, a gradual shift from social animal to solitary worker. Some farmers may have used this time for prayer, letting the rhythm of walking become the rhythm of devotion. Others may have simply let their minds wander, thinking about nothing in particular, enjoying the rare solitude. Either way, the walk provided a buffer, a gradual entry into the quiet concentration of agricultural work. We have largely lost this in modern life. Most of us do not walk to work. We drive or ride transit, enclosed in vehicles, moving too fast to really see the landscape we pass through. The commute is something to be endured rather than experienced, time lost rather than time used. The experience of daily, purposeful walking through a known environment, the meditation of repeated footsteps on familiar ground is rare now. It was common for the Maya. Every day, twice a day, the farmer's walk connected home to field, village to forest, social self to solitary self. It was a small thing, perhaps, but small things, repeated daily for a lifetime, shape who we are. The colonial wound. We have touched on this before, but it deserves its own section, its own space for contemplation. The damage that colonial conquest did to Maya agriculture and, through agriculture, to Maya life. The wound was deep, cutting through layers of practice and meaning, severing connections that had been maintained for millennia, and in some ways, it has never fully healed. The Spanish conquest of the Maya lowlands was not a single event, but a process that unfolded over decades, starting in the 1520s and continuing in some regions until the late 1690s. Unlike the Aztec Empire, which fell when its capital was captured and its emperor killed, the Maya city-states had to be conquered piecemeal, each one offering its own resistance, each one requiring its own campaign. Some areas were not fully subdued until more than 150 years after Cortés first landed on the Mexican coast. This extended conquest meant extended disruption, years and decades during which normal agricultural life was impossible for many communities. The encomienda system granted Spanish colonizers rights to indigenous labor, rights that were theoretically limited but practically unlimited, theoretically regulated but practically uncontrolled. Maya farmers who should have been tending their own milpas were instead required to work Spanish fields, harvesting crops they would not eat for masters they had not chosen. They were required to build Spanish buildings, carrying stones and mixing mortar for churches and haciendas. They were required to serve Spanish households, cooking and cleaning and carrying for people who saw them as property rather than persons. The time and energy that had sustained family agriculture was redirected toward colonial extraction, away from the milpas that fed families, toward the projects that enriched colonizers. The congregación policy was perhaps even more damaging in the long term. Spanish administrators, for both religious and administrative convenience, forced dispersed rural populations to relocate into concentrated towns. Scattered homesteads near family milpas were abandoned. People were compelled to move into planned settlements laid out according to Spanish ideas of proper town planning, with a central plaza and a church and streets in a grid. This made it easier for missionaries to convert souls and administrators to collect tribute, easier to count and control and tax. But it severed the connection between families and the scattered forest plots they had cultivated for generations. The milpa system required access to extensive forest lands in various stages of fallow, lands that might be scattered across a territory of several square miles. A family might have plots in different directions from their home, at different distances, in different stages of the cultivation cycle. The system worked because people lived near their land, could visit their plots daily, could respond to problems quickly, could maintain the close relationship with the soil that successful farming required. When farmers were moved away from those lands, when the distance between village and field became prohibitive, when the scattered plots became unreachable, the system collapsed. And there were the diseases. We have mentioned them before, but their devastation bears repeating, bears being held in mind as we contemplate what was lost. Smallpox arrived first, brought unknowingly by the Spanish, spreading faster than the conquerors themselves moved. It swept through populations that had no immunity, no experience with this particular pathogen, no traditional medicines or nursing practices adapted to its symptoms. The Maya had effective treatments for the diseases they knew, the diseases that had been with them for centuries, but they had nothing for this new killer. Measles followed, and typhus, and influenza, and a dozen other old-world diseases. Wave after wave of epidemic illness swept through Maya communities, killing perhaps 90% of the population in some areas over the first century of contact. Whole villages died. Whole lineages disappeared. The elders who knew the rituals, the farmers who knew the fields, the mothers who knew how to prepare the corn, so many of them died that the transmission of knowledge was broken, that traditions maintained for millennia came within a generation of being lost entirely. The colonial wound was not just physical, it was also epistemic, a wound to knowledge, to tradition, to the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Spanish colonizers dismissed Maya agriculture as primitive, as backward, as evidence of the inferiority that justified conquest. They tried to replace it with European methods, ploughing instead of digging sticks, wheat instead of corn, cattle instead of forest gardens. Maya languages were suppressed, their children educated in Spanish, punished for speaking their parents' tongues. Maya religious practices were forbidden, the rituals that accompanied planting and harvest condemned as paganism, their practitioners persecuted. The integration of agriculture and spirituality that had given the milpa its meaning was attacked from both sides. The practical techniques were disrupted by labor extraction and population movement. The spiritual framework was condemned and suppressed by missionaries who saw any indigenous practice as devil worship. The whole system, practical and sacred together, was targeted for destruction. And yet the milpa survived. That survival is almost miraculous. Through all the destruction, through all the death and displacement and cultural suppression, Maya farmers continued to plant corn and beans and squash in the old ways. They maintained the seeds, saved from each harvest, passed from generation to generation. They preserved the techniques, whispered from parent to child when no one was watching. They continued the prayers, quietly, hidden from colonial authorities who would have forbidden them. The colonial wound was deep, but it was not fatal. The milpa endured. The corn still grows. The milpa in memory. In the highland towns of Guatemala, in the villages of the Yucatan Peninsula, in the forests of Chiapas and the valleys of Belize, Maya farmers still plant milpas. This is not historical reenactment performed for tourists. This is not cultural preservation funded by government grants. This is living agriculture, practiced because it works, because it feeds families, because it connects the present to the past in ways that matter to the people doing it. The continuity is remarkable, almost unprecedented. A farmer planting corn in a Guatemalan highland village today is using techniques that his grandfather used, and his grandfather before him, and so on back through the centuries. The specific varieties of seeds may have changed somewhat, adapted to new conditions or crossed with other varieties. The exact timing of planting may have shifted as climate patterns changed. But the essential system, the three sisters, the fallow rotations, the integration of practical labor with spiritual meaning, remains recognizable, remains continuous with what his ancestors did centuries ago. The seeds themselves carry genetic continuity, biological memory encoded in DNA. Landrace varieties of maize, beans and squash have been selected and saved and replanted for hundreds of generations, adapted to local conditions in ways that no commercial seed company could replicate. These are not standardized crops bred for uniformity and yield. They are local varieties, each one shaped by the particular environment where it has been grown, each one carrying the accumulated preferences of generations of farmers who chose which seeds to save and which to eat. The prayers said before planting are prayers that echo across time. The specific words may have changed, adapted to new circumstances, influenced by centuries of Christianity mixed with older beliefs. But the intent remains the acknowledgement that agriculture is not purely human effort, that success depends on forces beyond any farmer's control, that gratitude and humility are as essential as good technique. The farmers who kneel at the edge of their milpas today are reenacting something their ancestors did, making the same gestures of respect toward the same powers, continuing a conversation that has been going on for millennia. This is not to say that nothing has changed. Modern Maya farmers often combine traditional milpa cultivation with wage labor, working part of the year in cities or on commercial plantations to earn cash income. The pure subsistence farming of the past is rare now. The modern economy reaches everywhere, creating needs that the milpa alone cannot satisfy. Some farmers have incorporated synthetic fertilizers or herbicides into their practice, reducing labor but changing the system's character. Migration has scattered Maya communities across Mexico, Guatemala, and the United States, creating diaspora populations that maintain cultural connections to home villages even when they can no longer farm there. The milpa exists in a changed world, and it has changed with it, but the core of the system persists. The three sisters are still planted together. The fallow rotations are still practiced where land is available, where the economics make sense, where farmers have access to enough forest to maintain the cycle. The ritual calendar still guides planting in many communities, days marked as favourable or unfavourable according to traditions that long predate the Gregorian calendar. The corn is still sacred, still understood as something more than a commodity, still connected to identity and ancestry and meaning, in ways that no amount of modernity has erased. The milpa is not a museum exhibit, not a fossil preserved for scholarly study. It is a living tradition, adapted and adaptable, persistent as the farmers who maintain it. There is a word for this kind of persistence: resistance. Not armed resistance, though the Maya have engaged in that too when necessary. But quieter resistance, the resistance of continuing to exist, continuing to practice, continuing to be who you are, despite pressures to become something else. Every milpa planted is an act of resistance against forgetting. Every seed saved is a refusal to abandon the past. The colonial wound never fully healed, but it did not kill. The milpa endures. Mini-documentary. The seeds that survived. Let us pause here and tell a smaller story within the larger one. A story about survival and persistence at the smallest scale, the scale of the individual seed. This is the story of landrace varieties, not seeds in general, but specific seeds, particular varieties that have been passed from hand to hand across centuries, carrying in their genetics the accumulated preferences and priorities of generations of farmers. Every crop we eat is the product of selection. This is true of industrial agriculture with its deliberate breeding programs, but it was also true long before modern genetics existed, true from the very beginning of agriculture. Wild corn, its ancestor, is a grass called teosinte, bears little resemblance to modern maize. Teosinte has small ears, just a few inches long, with hard kernels encased in tough shells that shatter when the grain is ripe. It looks nothing like the fat, golden ears we associate with corn. Over thousands of years, Mesoamerican farmers selected for larger ears, softer kernels, greater yield. They did this without understanding genetics, without knowing anything about genes or chromosomes or heredity. They simply saved seeds from the plants that produced the best results, the largest ears, the most kernels, the best tasting meal, and planted those seeds the following season. Generation by generation, teosinte became corn. But the selection did not stop at corn as a general category. Maya farmers developed dozens of distinct varieties, scores of them, perhaps hundreds, each one adapted to particular conditions, selected for particular qualities. There were varieties that thrived in lowland heat and varieties suited to highland cold. There were varieties with large kernels ideal for making tortillas, and varieties with small kernels perfect for popping. There were varieties with red kernels and blue kernels and black kernels, used for special dishes or ceremonial purposes or simply because a particular family had always grown that colour. The diversity was staggering, a living library of genetic possibilities accumulated over millennia of selection. This diversity was itself a form of security, a kind of insurance against the uncertainties of agriculture. If one variety failed in a given year because of unusual weather, because of a new pest, because of conditions that favoured other plants others might succeed, if insects developed a preference for one type, they might ignore another. The multiplicity of varieties spread risk across the entire system, ensuring that total failure was rare even when individual failures were common. Modern industrial agriculture, by contrast, has converged on a handful of high-yielding varieties, each one optimized for maximum production under ideal conditions. These varieties are productive, spectacularly so, but they are also fragile, vulnerable to any stress that falls outside their narrow optimal range. A disease that affects one field of modern corn may affect every field planted with the same variety, because they are all genetically identical, all sharing the same strengths and the same weaknesses. The Maya approach was different, accept slightly lower maximum yields in exchange for greater stability and resilience, accept diversity as a feature rather than a bug. When the Spanish arrived, they brought their own crops: wheat, barley, rice, sugarcane. They also brought, perhaps without fully intending to, the assumption that new was better, that indigenous varieties should be replaced with European ones. Over the centuries, many traditional crop varieties were lost not to climate or pests, but to neglect and replacement and the pressure to adopt new methods. The drive to modernize pushed farmers away from the landrace varieties their ancestors had developed, toward commercial seeds that promised higher yields but required purchased inputs, that produced more in good years but failed more catastrophically in bad ones. But some farmers resisted. In every generation, there were families who saved the old seeds, who planted the traditional varieties even when extension agents and development projects urged them to modernize. These seed keepers were often ignored or dismissed, viewed as conservative or backward, obstacles to progress. They were, in fact, curators of irreplaceable genetic heritage, maintaining through their quiet stubbornness varieties that existed nowhere else on Earth. Today, agronomists and seed banks are scrambling to collect and preserve indigenous crop varieties before they disappear entirely. They have discovered what Maya farmers knew all along: diversity is strength. The genetic material contained in traditional landrace varieties may hold keys to developing crops that can withstand climate change, resist emerging pests, or grow in conditions that defeat commercial seeds. The traits that allowed those old varieties to survive centuries of cultivation in particular environments may be exactly what is needed for crops to survive the uncertain environments of the future. This is a kind of vindication, though a bittersweet one. The farmers who saved traditional seeds were right all along, right to be skeptical of modern replacements, right to trust what their ancestors had given them, right to resist the pressure to abandon diversity for uniformity. Their resistance, quiet and often unnoticed, preserved something valuable that might otherwise have been lost forever, preserved options that may prove essential for human survival. And so the seeds continue to be planted, season after season, in milpas scattered across the Maya world. Each seed carries a history. Each one connects the farmer who plants it to all the farmers who came before, reaching back through the centuries to the first domestication of teosinte into corn. The seeds that survived are living memory, genetic archaeology, time crystallized in each hard kernel. When they are planted, they carry the past into the present. When they germinate and grow, they carry the future forward. The continuity is almost mystical. The corn remembers even when we forget. The modern rediscovery. Sometime in the middle of the 20th century, a strange thing happened. Western agricultural scientists began to notice that the primitive farming systems they had dismissed for generations might actually have something to teach them. The insight came partly from failure. The Green Revolution of the 1960s and 70s had promised to end hunger through high-yielding crop varieties, synthetic fertilizers, and modern farming techniques. And it did increase production dramatically in many parts of the world. Rice yields in Asia doubled and tripled. Wheat production soared in India and Pakistan. The spectre of famine receded in regions where it had seemed endemic. Norman Borlaug, the agronomist most closely associated with the Green Revolution, won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work. It seemed like a triumph. But the triumph came with costs that were slower to become apparent. The high-yielding varieties required heavy inputs of fertilizer, which required money to purchase and fossil fuels to manufacture. They required irrigation, which depleted aquifers and diverted rivers. They required pesticides, which killed beneficial insects along with pests and left residues in soil and water. The promised revolution turned out to be less revolutionary than it had seemed, more like borrowing against the future than creating genuine new wealth. Against this backdrop, some researchers began to study traditional agricultural systems with fresh eyes. They noticed that indigenous farmers in many parts of the world had developed techniques that maintained soil fertility over centuries without external inputs. They noticed that polycultures often outperformed monocultures when total productivity was considered. They noticed that the primitive methods they had dismissed actually worked, had been working for millennia and might have something to teach modern agriculture. The milpa was a prime example, perhaps the best example anywhere on Earth. Here was a system that had fed dense populations for thousands of years, that maintained soil health through fallow rotations rather than chemical fertilizers, that controlled weeds and pests through polyculture and timing, rather than herbicides and pesticides. Modern agricultural science had nothing comparable, nothing that could claim such a long track record of sustainable production. The academic literature began to fill with terms like traditional ecological knowledge and agroecology. Researchers documented the companion planting of the three sisters, measuring how the beans fixed nitrogen and the squash suppressed weeds. They studied fallow rotations and found that the practice rebuilt soil organic matter, prevented erosion, and maintained biodiversity. The milpa, it turned out, was scientifically sophisticated, embodying principles that Western agriculture was only beginning to understand. This rediscovery was not without its ironies. Scientists were discovering what Maya farmers had known for 4,000 years. The knowledge had not been lost, it had been ignored, dismissed as primitive by people who assumed that new was always better than old, that Western was always superior to indigenous. The farmers who had maintained the milpa system through centuries of colonial dismissal and modern neglect had been right all along. Their methods were not backward. They were adapted, refined, tested by time. They worked. Today, agroecology has become a recognized field of study, taught in universities, published in peer-reviewed journals, taken seriously by at least some agricultural scientists and policymakers. Permaculture designers cite the milpa as a model. Sustainable agriculture advocates promote polyculture and crop rotation. International development organizations that once pushed farmers to adopt green revolution techniques now sometimes encourage them to maintain traditional practices. It is not quite an apology for centuries of dismissal, but it is a kind of acknowledgement that the dismissal was premature. Whether this rediscovery will change anything substantial is an open question. Industrial agriculture remains dominant globally, driven by economic pressures that traditional systems cannot easily compete with. Commercial seeds are cheaper in the short term, even if they require expensive inputs. Global markets reward uniformity and scale, not diversity and local adaptation. Most farmers cannot afford to let fields lie fallow for a decade when they need cash income now, this season. The milpa's wisdom is acknowledged in academic papers but difficult to implement in an economy organized around different principles. Still, the knowledge persists, the farmers persist, and in a warming, destabilizing world, the techniques that sustained Maya civilization through centuries of challenge may yet prove more relevant than the industrial methods that are already beginning to show their limits. The milpa is patient. It has been waiting 4,000 years. It can wait a while longer. The persistence. It is early morning in a village in the highlands of Guatemala. The year is this year, the present moment now. A farmer wakes before dawn, as his father woke and his grandfather woke and all the fathers and grandfathers stretching back beyond memory. His wife is preparing tortillas on the comal, the same sound his great-grandmother would have heard, the slap of hands shaping corn dough. He drinks atole, sweet and warm, then gathers his tools and begins the walk to his milpa. The path takes him through secondary forest, past the resting plots that will be ready for planting in another few years, past the older fallow where substantial trees have grown back. He knows each turning, each landmark, each tree that marks a boundary. His father walked this path before him, and his father's father. The continuity is not metaphorical, not a pleasant thought but a physical reality, embodied in the landscape and in his muscle memory of the walk. At the milpa, he begins the day's work. The corn is young, knee-high, the leaves bright green in the early light, reaching toward the sun that is just now clearing the mountains to the east. Beans are just beginning to send up their tendrils, searching for something to climb. The squash seeds have germinated. Though the plants are still small, their leaves no larger than his hand. There is weeding to do, as there always is. He bends to the task, his movements automatic, his mind free to wander wherever it will. In a world of smartphones and satellites, of algorithms and artificial intelligence, of global supply chains and just-in-time delivery, A man is bent over a cornfield doing work his ancestors did 4,000 years ago. There is something almost absurd about this, a disconnect between the pace of technological change and the persistence of human tradition. The world has transformed utterly since the first milpa was planted. And yet here he is, doing the same work in the same way, following the same rhythms. Here the milpa is, still productive, still feeding families, still encoding in its practice a philosophy of patience and reciprocity that no amount of modernity has erased. The persistence of the milpa is not heroic in any dramatic sense. There are no monuments commemorating it, no famous names associated with it, no decisive battles or turning points. It is quiet persistence, the persistence of doing the same thing day after day, season after season, generation after generation. It is the persistence of seeds saved and replanted, of techniques passed from parent to child, of knowledge accumulated slowly and held against loss. It is persistence as its own kind of resistance, the refusal to disappear, to abandon, to forget. And perhaps that is the milpa's deepest lesson, if we are willing to learn from it. Empires rise and fall, and the milpa endures. Cities are built and abandoned, and the milpa endures. Technologies emerge and become obsolete, and the milpa endures. The human need for food continues. The relationship between farmer and soil continues. The seed planted in spring, harvested in fall, and planted again the following spring, that cycle continues. The milpa is a monument to continuity, to the possibility that some things can persist across centuries if enough people care enough to maintain them. Whether we carry that lesson forward, whether we apply it to our own lives and our own traditions, is up to us. The Maya legacy reconsidered. What does the milpa ultimately tell us about the civilization that created it? What does it reveal about Maya values, Maya priorities, Maya understanding of the world and their place in it? These are questions worth sitting with as we near the end of our journey together, worth holding in your mind as you settle towards sleep. The Maya are often remembered for their monumental achievements, the things that survive in stone and can be photographed for textbooks. The pyramids of Tikal and Palenque, rising above the jungle canopy. The elaborate carvings that decorate temple walls, depicting gods and kings in intricate detail. The hieroglyphic writing system, one of the world's great intellectual achievements, only deciphered in our own time. The astronomical observations, accurate enough to predict eclipses centuries in advance. These are impressive accomplishments, and they deserve to be remembered. But perhaps the milpa is as significant an achievement as any pyramid, as important a legacy as any inscription. The milpa fed the workers who built those pyramids, provided the calories that fueled their labour. It sustained the populations that inhabited those cities, generating the surplus that allowed specialization and social complexity. It provided the foundation that allowed scribes to develop writing and astronomers to study the stars. Without the milpa, there is no Maya civilization. The cornfield is the foundation on which everything else was built. And the milpa tells us something about Maya values that the monuments alone do not reveal, something about how they thought and what they considered important. It tells us that this was a civilization that thought in long time scales, that planned not just for this season but for the seasons of their grandchildren, that accepted limits in the present for the sake of possibilities in the future. It tells us that they understood interdependence, the three sisters supporting each other, the forest and the field in rotational partnership as a core principle of survival, as true in agriculture as in human relationships. It tells us that they integrated practical work with spiritual meaning, refusing to separate the labour of the hands from the aspirations of the soul. It tells us that they knew limits, accepted them, built their systems around them rather than endlessly trying to transcend them. These are not universal values. Not every civilization shares them. Our own modern world is built on very different assumptions. Short time horizons measured in fiscal quarters rather than generations, individual competition rather than interdependence, secular production divorced from spiritual meaning, unlimited growth as the measure of success. The milpa stands as an alternative vision, a road not taken, a suggestion that other ways of organizing human life are possible. Whether that suggestion is relevant to our present challenges, Whether we can learn anything from a 4,000-year-old agricultural system is not for me to say. I am simply describing what the Maya did, how they lived, what choices they made, and what consequences followed. The milpa's legacy is also a cautionary tale, a reminder that wisdom is not the same as invincibility. Maya civilization did not persist forever in its classic form. The collapse of the 9th century saw the abandonment of many major lowland cities, the end of monument building and long count dating, a transformation whose causes are still debated by scholars. Environmental factors almost certainly played a role. Some researchers believe that population growth pushed the milpa system past its limits, forcing shorter fallow periods that degraded soils and reduced yields. Others point to drought, to warfare, to political dysfunction, to combinations of factors that reinforced each other. The truth is probably complex. The point is that the milpa, for all its wisdom, was not a guarantee against failure. It was a system adapted to particular conditions, and when those conditions changed through population pressure, climate shift, or social disruption, the system could be stressed beyond its capacity. The Maya learned to work with the forest, but even that knowledge could not protect them from every possible disaster. Humility is warranted here. The milpa was wise, but it was not magic. It worked until it didn't, and then the Maya adapted and survived and continued in new forms. What remains is persistence. The post-classic Maya adapted to new conditions, survived the collapse of the old order, continued in different configurations. When the Spanish came, they adapted again, survived again, continued again. Through colonialism and modernization, through civil war and globalization, the milpa has persisted. That persistence is the ultimate legacy. Not a guarantee of success, but an example of resilience, of the possibility of maintaining something valuable across time, even when the world changes around it. The Maya built pyramids of stone, and some still stand. They created writing systems and astronomical tables, and some survive. But they also built something more durable than any monument, a tradition of cultivation that continues to feed their descendants today. The corn is still growing, the farmers are still planting, the seeds are still being saved. That is an achievement worth honouring, worth remembering, worth carrying with you into sleep. Closing reflection. We began this journey with dirt, and we end with dirt. The dark, root-threaded soil of the milpa, turned and planted and left to rest and turned again, century after century, carrying in its structure the accumulated labour and wisdom of generations. Soil is humble. It is easy to overlook, easy to take for granted, easy to forget as we move through lives increasingly disconnected from the earth that feeds us. But everything grows from it, and to it everything returns. The milpa is not a utopia. The labour was hard, physically demanding in ways that few modern people ever experience. The harvests were uncertain, dependent on rains and seasons and forces beyond any farmer's control. The lives of traditional farmers were bounded by the limits of their technology and the caprices of weather and disease. We should not romanticize a system that involved back-breaking work under tropical sun, that sometimes failed despite the best efforts of those who practiced it. The Maya were human beings, not saints, and their agriculture was a practical response to practical problems, not a spiritual ideal disconnected from sweat and hunger and the fear of famine. And yet there is something in the milpa worth remembering, worth dreaming about as you drift towards sleep on this particular night in this particular moment of your life. The patience of it, the willingness to wait years for the forest to regenerate, to plant seeds whose harvest will be reaped by future generations, to trust in cycles longer than any individual life. The reciprocity of it, the understanding that soil and forest and farmer are partners, each giving something the others need, each dependent on the health of the whole. The integration of it, the refusal to separate work from meaning, practical necessity from sacred purpose, the labour of the body from the aspirations of the spirit. These are values that modern life often lacks, qualities that our systems seem designed to discourage. We are encouraged to want everything now, to maximise short-term returns, to extract as much as possible as quickly as possible and worry about consequences later. The milpa suggests a different possibility, a different way of relating to time and earth and each other. It does not insist that we adopt its methods. The conditions are different now. The scale is different. The pressures are different. But it offers an example. It demonstrates that alternatives are possible. It shows that a civilization can sustain itself for millennia by working with limits rather than against them. The corn continues to grow in the milpas of Guatemala and Chiapas, the Yucatan and Belize. The farmers continue to walk the forest paths at dawn, their feet following routes their ancestors wore smooth. They continue to bend over the rows of young plants, pulling weeds, checking progress, tending the same crops their ancestors tended when the pyramids were new. They continue to harvest in the fall and plant again in spring, saving seeds, passing knowledge, maintaining the conversation between humans and Earth that has been going on for 4,000 years. The cycle continues. The persistence continues. The milpa continues. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the point is not to draw grand lessons or prescribe solutions, not to tell you what to think or how to live. Perhaps the point is simply to notice. Here is something that endured. Here is something that sustained life for thousands of years and continues to sustain it still. Here is a way of being in relationship with the earth that is different from our own, neither better nor worse in some final accounting, but different, and therefore valuable, and therefore worth remembering, and therefore worth carrying with you into whatever dreams await. Sleep now. Let the rhythm of the milpa settle into your breathing, slow and steady, patient and trusting. The corn is growing in the fields, quiet and green, reaching toward the light. The beans are climbing toward the sky, tendrils wrapping around cornstalks, fixing nitrogen in the dark soil below. The squash leaves are spreading across the earth, shading and protecting, doing their quiet work. Somewhere, a farmer is walking home through the forest as the last light fades. He is tired in the good way, the way that earns sleep. The evening meal is waiting for him. His children are telling stories. The last light is filtering through the palm thatch roof, turning everything gold and then amber and then dark. The seeds remember what we forget. The soil remembers what we forget. The milpa remembers what we forget. And now you carry some of that memory too, held lightly, carried gently as you drift toward dreams. May your sleep be deep and restful. May you wake refreshed, carrying with you the patience of centuries, the wisdom of slow time, and the quiet persistence of those who learned to grow what they needed without destroying what they loved. The corn grows, the farmer sleeps, the cycle continues, as it has continued for 4,000 years, as it will continue long after this night has passed. Good night.